The mistake I made that night was believing safety had a look. I thought it wore warm light and good bread and a man with a shy smile. I thought safety looked like a small table by a window and a street lamp with patient light. It took me one evening in Miami to learn that safety doesn't make a sound when it leaves. I was 21 in the summer of 1983, a year old enough to carry my own keys and young enough to trust neon more than wisdom. Miami was a humid breath around everything, hair lifting at the edges, skin shining at the collarbones, streets painted with signs promising coffee, music, and a city that kept inventing ways to stay awake. My name is Maria. Back then, I worked a job that paid rent and little else, and I kept my jewelry simple. Small gold hoops and a thin silver bracelet that belonged to my mother before it belonged to me. When I touched that bracelet, I remembered the kitchen of our old apartment, a square of sun on the table, her hands moving with practical grace, a pot releasing the scent of citrus and garlic that could pull neighbors into conversation. That bracelet was my anchor. I wore it on first dates, as if metal could teach the body a rhythm steadier than nerves. Rody, short for Rodrigo, was quiet in crowds, happiest when talking about records, and careful with the way he looked at you when you spoke, like he had decided that listening was a form of devotion. He worked at a store downtown where the sleeves smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, and the regulars sorted themselves into camps with passionate arguments about pressing quality, as if the right groove spacing could save a soul. I had met him at a friend's party where the music was too loud for thinking, and he had leaned in, not to talk over it, but to suggest we step into the hall so he could hear me better. That was the part that stayed with me. Not his smile, his asking to hear. A week later, he pulled up outside my building in a Chevy that had already lived too many lives, but kept showing up. The passenger door opened with effort. The vinyl seat announced every shift in weight. He apologized for the heat, rolled down the windows, and aimed the vents like that would change Florida. I pressed the bracelet with my thumb. The metal was cool and persuasive. Steady, I told myself. Keep breathing and let the night be what it is. We drove through neighborhoods I recognized by smell as much as sight. This street meant coffee and tobacco. That one meant bread pulled from an oven, and the small decision to stand in the doorway a little longer than necessary. Miami on a summer evening can look like optimism disguised as humidity. Rody kept the radio low. Some new wave track that he liked, and I pretended to know. He didn't fill the car with chatter. He let the city do some of the work. As if to say, we were already in a conversation bigger than either of us. He'd chosen a little Cuban restaurant in Little Havana that friends praised with the kind of affection people usually reserve for relatives. Tiles the color of mango and seawater, a counter polished by years of elbows, walls crowded with framed photographs, weddings, children in white shoes, a group of men with hats tilted at identical angles. It was not the kind of place that tried to impress you. It was the kind that assumed you belonged. The host guided us to a table near the window where a street lamp spread a clean circle on the sidewalk. I remember thinking the light made everything look more possible. We ordered with the confidence of people who trust the house. Croquetas with their crisp exteriors and tender centers. Black beans coaxed into softness by patience. Roast pork perfumed with sour orange. Rice that behaved like comfort even before you tasted it. The room carried a layered fragrance. Garlic. Coffee being poured at the counter. Sugar dissolving into heat. My shoulders lowered from my ears. I tasted my water like it had been designed just for this minute. Rhodey began talking about a record he'd found. A rare import pressing that the owner insisted should live in the display by the register. He explained why the first track mattered, how the drums arrived a fraction earlier than expected, and taught your body a new rule. I didn't understand the technical part, but I understood devotion. The way his eyes brightened when he cared about something. The way he did not rush his sentences. Notice how quickly you forgive a room when it smells like home. I thought, even though it was not my home, and the memories it called up belonged to other people's kitchens. I could feel a fine edge of nerves smoothing under the scrape of a chair leg. The clatter of silver on china, the low hum of families working through Saturday stories. I caught my reflection in the window, haloed by the street lamp, and the image felt almost tender, like watching a younger cousin you hope will learn some things the gentle way. Outside, the sidewalk carried couples with hands laced, unhurried cars easing past, a boy guiding his bike with one hand while he ate something wrapped in paper with the other. Inside, our waiter had the balanced focus of a man who could carry 4 plates and a conversation at once. He answered Rhodey's question about a singer's hometown like it mattered. Like this detail belonged in a book that he would help us complete by the end of dessert. We were 2 young people leaning toward possibility. If you had walked past the glass then, you would have seen a small story. 2 faces lit by a lamp, a water glass shining beside a basket of bread, a thin band of silver catching the light near a lifted wrist. I did not notice the car that stopped beyond the curb, or the faces turned toward the door. I noticed only the way Rhodey's mouth shaped a word about percussion. the way my pulse slowed enough to make room for food. The first hint was not a sound. It was pressure, the way the air changed around us without asking, like the room inhaled and held it. Then the window beside us ceased being a window. It dissolved into shards driven inward, a glittering storm that pulled the entire room into a single instruction. Bodies moved in a pattern older than thought. Down, under, cover. My chair tilted, my knees found tile, my hands found the underside of a tablecloth that smelled faintly of citrus oil and starch. I reached for my bracelet and touched only my wrist. Someone's elbow had brushed it in the sudden scramble, and it had slipped to the crook of my palm. Stay small. Stay still. Keep counting your breath. Rhodey's hand found mine. He held it, not like a boyfriend, but like a person caught in a current holds a branch around us. The restaurant changed its shape. The voices became a single body made of breath and prayer and questions too large to say out loud. Somewhere near the bar, a glass fell and parted into pieces. A woman sat on the floor, pressing a cloth to her arm. Not crying, simply doing what the situation required. A man near the door crouched with his back against the wall. Eyes closed, lips moving in Spanish, too soft to carry words to me, but strong enough to give him a place to stand inside himself. I did not look toward the street. I refused to give my eyes a new image to carry. I stared at the hem of the tablecloth and at a tile shaped like a small blue wave, and at the slow motion of my own chest. The mind does something strange when it knows it has no control. It chooses small, measurable tasks. Count 4 in, 4 out. Find the bracelet. Press your tongue to the roof of your mouth to stop it from shaking. Remember one thing you love that is still true. I chose my mother's kitchen. The square of sun on the table. How she always folded a towel the same way before she set down a pot. The rush of destruction that had taken the window and the room's innocence did not continue forever. It came in a burst of force and then withdrew, leaving a silence that felt heavy enough to bruise. The waiter who had kept our table in his mental grid moved on his knees from one cluster of people to the next, telling us not to stand yet, saying help was coming. Voice low and steady, like the line you draw under an answer, so you remember it later. He checked the woman's arm, guided someone to press a clean cloth over the wound, and turned to speak to the kitchen, where more faces peered into the dining room with a kind of stunned alertness. when the first officers appeared at the door. The room shifted around their presence the way a small boat steadies when larger waves pass. One of them leaned toward the broken window and told us to stay inside. Another scanned the street, one hand lifted, eyes tracking a pattern only he could see. I didn't know whether the person responsible had already gone or stood somewhere out of view. I knew only the discipline of not moving, of letting other people set the terms of what came next. They asked us to come out from under the tables only after they had decided the immediate danger had passed. Standing felt like learning to walk again. The tile tilted even though it was level. My legs registered every degree of pressure like a new language. I helped Rhodey brush specks of glass from his sleeves, and he helped me find my bracelet, which had slipped across the floor and come to rest near the leg of a chair. The silver felt warmer than before. I slid it back and promised it I would be kinder with my hands. The restaurant in daylight is a place for celebration. The restaurant in the hour after harm is an evidence field and a sanctuary in the same square footage. Chairs leaned at crooked angles. A plate stood against a wall, as if a flung discus had decided to become a decoration. Coffee darkened a patch of tile in a shape that would look like a continent on a map. Strangers behaved like neighbors. One person offering napkins folded with an almost ceremonial care. Another clearing a path by lifting chairs slowly, so the sound would not add to what our bodies already held. We didn't have a name yet for why it had happened. The beginnings of explanations drifted. A political message, a dissident, a person angry enough to target a place that meant something to a community, but not cruel enough, perhaps, to stay long enough to take lives. I didn't trust theories. I trusted the woman applying pressure to her arm, the waiter making eye contact with each table, the owner standing very still before he spoke so he would not let his fear make promises he could not keep. An officer took our names and addresses and asked for anything we might have seen. I told him about the air changing before the window went, about where we sat in relation to the street, about the angle of the lamp outside. He wrote in slow letters that made each syllable look deliberate. Rhodey answered questions about timing, and then looked at me as if to ask whether the world had always been like this, and we had simply failed to notice. I didn't have an answer. I had only the simple relief of being upright in a room where everyone else could stand too. When they said we could leave, the instruction felt both generous and impossible. Stepping outside asked more of me than I expected. The night air opened like a cathedral without a roof. Neon washed the street in colors that usually meant joy. My brain received them as caution. Rhodey walked beside me with a pace calibrated to my stride. He did not try to talk the evening into goodness. He unlocked the car as if unlocking a door for someone who has been awake too long. We drove without the radio. The city's usual music moved past us behind glass that had not betrayed us. He parked in front of my building and asked if I was all right. It was not a question with one answer. "Not yet," I said. He nodded and let the quiet be a kind of respect. I sat for a minute longer than necessary. My hand on the bracelet the way people touch the back of a chair before they lift it. Everything in my apartment looked bright and ordinary. The clean dishes stacked in the rack, the pair of shoes by the door with their laces tucked in, the small plate where I set my keys each night. I went through the rituals that usually lead a person into rest and discovered that my body refused. When I closed my eyes, the window did what it had already done. The glass lifted and let go. The room demanded I choose a single action and repeat it until morning. Breathe, count, touch the silver, and remember a kitchen where the worst thing that could happen was a pot boiling over. Safety does not announce itself when it returns. I learned. It inches back in pieces that look like the patience to drink water, the willingness to stand under a shower and let heat convince muscles to loosen, the courage to walk to a corner store and buy milk because breakfast is a vote for staying. By sunrise, I could stand at the window without flinching at movement on the street. I did not look for the restaurant's news. I made coffee and let it cool while I stared at the line of bow light across my table. A thin gold ribbon moving slowly from the salt to the sugar to the vase with nothing in it. I was not fine. I was beginning. To anyone who wants a moral simple enough to stitch on a pillow. I am not your narrator. I am a woman who learned that night that terror is not the only thing that scales. So does tenderness. The waiter's steady tone, the owner's stillness, Rhodey's careful steps, the bracelet that kept insisting I was still here, the morning after. My mother's voice waited on my answering machine, bright and practical, asking about my date and whether the restaurant had lived up to its reputation. I called her back and practiced the kind of honesty that protects both people. I said it was eventful. She asked what I meant. I promised to tell her the rest later and asked about her day instead. I needed to borrow her normal for a few minutes. Later, I told her the truth. careful with each detail, making room between sentences for breath. She went quiet in a way I recognized. Not the kind of quiet that closes a door, the kind that stands guard beside a person until the room becomes safe enough to speak again. Rhodey called that afternoon. He asked how I was and told me someone at the record store claimed to know the owner's cousin and had already told the half-city version of our evening to 3 other people by noon. Miami can be a village when it wants to be. He said his boss told him to take the day, and he suggested we meet for coffee at a place with walls that did not face the street. I said yes, and then told him I might change my mind at the last minute, which is another way of saying I was learning the shape of my limits. He said he would understand either way. The news traveled in rumors before it traveled in print. A dissident, people said. A message sent to a place that meant more than food. Wrong night, wrong window, wrong group of people to frighten. The kindness of that story, a person who wanted to damage a symbol more than bodies, did not comfort me. Terror is not softened by intent. It lands where it lands. It leaves the same residue in the muscles. It teaches a vigilance that costs interest you do not remember agreeing to pay. I tried the coffee place. I chose a table in the middle, far from the front windows and the back exit. Rhodey arrived with his careful pace and the way he sat, not too close and not performing distance, made me feel like I could occupy all of my own chair without apology. He talked about records, because that is what he knows how to do when he cannot fix a thing. I listened, because sometimes normal speech is the medicine. We mentioned the restaurant only when necessary. The conversation moved between weather and a show he wanted to see, and a story I told about my mother teaching me to cook rice without measuring, because the hand can learn what the cup already knows. When we left, we stood on the sidewalk longer than the conversation required, because endings felt like cliffs. He asked if he could call again in a few days. I told him I would like that. Night noises taught my body new reflexes. A door closing 2 apartments down, something that had never mattered, made my shoulders rise. A car misfiring on the next block pressed my jaw tight before my brain named the sound. I noticed myself checking the edges of rooms. I noticed how often my hands touched the bracelet and how the skin there began to hold a thin, bright line from all that contact. The line looked like a scar made of light. I did not mind it. It made sense that the place I used as an anchor would mark me. We went on another date a week later, in a different neighborhood, at a place where the windows were high and narrow, and the tables were tucked in like secrets. The food was fine. The company was kind. The spark people promised should follow did not arrive. I don't blame the absence on what happened. I think sometimes two good people meet on a night that scars them, and afterward their gentleness belongs to the memory they share more than it belongs to romance. We walked after dinner and talked about the movie listings like two friends who have just discovered they would rather not pretend to be anything else. When he dropped me off, he took my hand the way he had under the table, steady, sincere, grateful we both had hands to offer. The restaurant in Little Havana stayed closed for a while. The windows wore plywood and new stickers. Someone wrote a blessing on one sheet in black marker in a hand that looked like a cousin's months later when it reopened. I went past it on the other side of the street. The tables looked right again, cloth smooth and centered, glasses catching light. Families laughed in the way that lets air move easily in and out of a room. I loved that the place had found its voice again. I could not go in. The body has its own calendar. You can respect it or fight it. I chose respect. Friends asked about the night, and I told them versions that matched their faces. The ones who thrived on details got the shape of the window and the square of light on the floor, and the exact way the waiter said we should stay down. The ones who wear their hearts thin got the smallest telling. The kind you deliver with a hand on a shoulder. Something happened, and we are okay. And when you go out tonight, sit where your body tells you to sit, because you are allowed to choose the seat near the wall. The seat with your back to a corner. The seat that lets you see an exit without apology. When I finally went back to Little Havana in daylight, I let my feet decide the route, and they took me past a bakery where a woman dusted powdered sugar in a slow snow over pastries lined like soldiers, past a barber leaning on his door jamb, greeting people by name, past a man with a domino table who looked up only to smile at a toddler who had dropped a piece of bread and was attempting to retrieve it without bending his knees. The city had refused to become only the memory of harm. It kept insisting on being itself, fiery and generous and noisy, in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with life refusing to shrink. I crossed the street when the restaurant appeared ahead. I let myself look at the window only long enough to notice that the lead lines formed squares again, and the reflections from the sign across the street laid a ribbon of color on the glass. I touched the bracelet and said, not out loud, we are not required to walk through every door we once used. Therapy came later. Not because I didn't trust my own mind, but because I wanted help teaching it that the present can be more persuasive than the past. The therapist was a woman with calm clothing and a voice that never sharpened. She asked me to tell the story without skipping the parts that made my breath shorten. She did not rush the telling. She did not swallow my pauses. She taught me to notice what my body did when it felt threatened and to give it other choices. She didn't hand me a cure. She handed me a map and let me draw my own roads. I learned to mark safe places, the chair by my window in the morning, the aisle seat 5 rows from the back at the movie theater, the corner table at the cafe where I could watch people enter and leave while my coffee did its small steam. I kept the bracelet on through all of it. Over the years, the silver thinned in places from turning it with my thumb. That wearing down comforted me. It meant the metal had taken some of the work out of my skin and turned it into shine. When I met someone new and he asked me about the bracelet, I told him it was my mother's. If he asked for the story behind it, I gave him a part of the restaurant night only if I felt the room could hold it. If he tried to tell me, it was time to let go. I understood that he did not know what it means to live with what you've lived and still choose to love the world in front of you. The last time I saw Rhodey, he was stacking sleeves at the record store, a new shipment arriving like fresh possibility. We traded a look that said we shared a page from a book other people might never read. He told me about a pressing he hoped to find before the year ended. I told him about a class I had started taking at night. We wished each other an easy week, which is another way of blessing someone without sounding like a sermon. I walked out into a city that looked different and the same, the neon still staking its claim against night, the air still holding on to heat longer than seemed reasonable, the sidewalks still performing their parade of families and lovers and people who have some place to be. People ask for lessons from nights like mine because they want to carry a rule instead of a story. I do not have a rule that will save you. I have the way a waiter's steadiness can build a bridge from terror back to standing. I have the understanding that windows are not promises. They are opportunities that can fail without warning. I have the fact that a room can be both a target and a refuge in a single hour, and you may have to let it be both without hating it for the first part. I have a bracelet that lived in my mother's kitchen before it lived in a restaurant under a table with me, and then lived in every day after that as a small, bright circle that says, "Remain." Years later, I sat at a cafe far from Miami and watched people check their reflections in the glass. A couple leaned toward each other with hands folded. A child lifted a spoon like a trophy. The sky traded daylight for the first hints of evening. A server set a cup before me and asked whether I needed anything else. I said I was all right. It was true in the only way truth belongs to the present. The past did not disappear. It joined me like a quiet companion at the table and agreed to let this hour be this hour. When I walk now, I still choose seats that let me see a door. I still note exits the way some people note paintings. I still keep a small inventory of anchors I can reach without looking. Keys, spine of a book, edge of a table, the bead of a bracelet under my thumb. I no longer confuse quiet with safety or noise with risk. I know they travel together. Trading masks, I know that survival looks less like heroics and more like a woman who learned to let light touch her again without flinching. The night in Little Havana did not become my whole life. It became a chapter with strong ink. It taught me how quickly a photograph can tear and how carefully you can tape it back, not to pretend it was never damaged, but to honor the faces and the light that remain legible. When I think of it now, I do not rehearse the glass in the air. I remember the first 10 minutes when everything tasted like orange and garlic and good bread, and Rhodey's voice found its ease. I remember the minutes after, when strangers acted like relatives, and a city that could have become a wound decided to be a home instead. If you need one more sentence to take with you, take this. Choose your anchors and keep them near. The bracelet, the seat that feels like a promise, the person who asks to hear you under the noise, the street lamp that keeps its circle of light, even when the window between you and the night forgets how to hold. They say first dates are meant to be butterflies, laughter, and a little bit of nervous excitement. But mine turned into something I can still feel in my bones, like a shadow that won't leave. I had been single for long enough that the thought of meeting someone new felt like a small adventure. Jay came into my life through an app. One of those endless swiping nights where faces blurred until his stopped me cold. He wasn't the type I usually went for. There was a roughness to him, an edge that made him stand out from the polished profiles. His photos were all fire and attitude, leaning against a glossy car with tinted windows, sneakers so bright they practically glowed, and captions that screamed confidence. Jay carried himself like the world was already his. Flashy posts, cocky smiles, a gold chain that gleamed even through the screen. Hood rich, people might call it. All swagger, little stability. But behind the cockiness, there was charm. Something in his words made me believe he could be fun, unpredictable in a way that pulled me in. We matched quickly. His messages weren't sweet, but sharp and direct, like he knew exactly how to get someone's attention. He asked me questions, teased me just enough, and before I knew it, I was hooked. When he suggested we go for a drive, nothing fancy, just a chill ride and maybe some food, I didn't hesitate. For days, I replayed it in my head. What would I wear? Would he be the same in person? Would I regret saying yes? There was a thrill in the waiting, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your imagination race. I told myself it was just a drive, just one evening, nothing to lose. That night, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have. I didn't want to look overdressed, so I settled on jeans, a fitted top, and sneakers. Simple, practical, ready for whatever came. My stomach fluttered when my phone buzzed with his text. I'm outside. I pulled back the curtain and froze. His car wasn't just loud. It announced itself to the entire street. The headlights glared like eyes in the dark. The body polished to a shine that reflected the street lamps. Even from my window, I could feel the bass from his sound system vibrating through the glass. Stepping outside felt like walking into another world. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and cold night. And there he was, leaning out of the driver's side window, grinning like he already owned the night. His chain caught the glow of the streetlight. His tracksuit hugged his frame, every inch of him screaming for attention. For a second, I almost laughed. He was too much, too showy, too polished in his own way. But when his eyes met mine, there was something else, an eagerness, maybe even nervousness, hiding beneath the bravado. That small crack in his armor made me slide into the passenger seat without thinking twice. The moment I closed the door, I was hit by a mix of scents: strong air freshener, polished leather, and something faintly musky that clung to him. The seat vibrated under me as the bass thumped from hidden speakers, and I realized how different this world was from mine. His world was louder, faster, hungrier. "Ready?" he asked, voice casual, but carrying a spark of excitement. I nodded, though my pulse was already picking up speed. The car purred forward, and as we rolled into the city lights, I told myself again, it's just a date, just one night, nothing more. But somewhere deep down, I felt a twinge I couldn't explain. like I was stepping into a story I wouldn't know how to end. There's a minute on every night drive when the road decides who's in charge. If you miss it, the decision gets made without you. We slipped deeper into the city, past storefronts closing for the evening, and bus stops with tired commuters staring at nothing. Jay talked like he was guiding a tour, what he'd done to the suspension, which neighborhood had the best late-night noodles, which streets the delivery drivers used when they wanted to skip traffic cameras. He spoke with the ease of someone who had memorized shortcuts the rest of us weren't supposed to know. "Want to see what it can do?" he asked. Eyes on the road, mouth tilted. He didn't wait for a yes. The question was a formality, a polished key already turning a lock. I pulled my seatbelt a little tighter and pretended to study the skyline through the windshield. A part of me wanted to laugh and tell him to behave. Another part wanted to earn a reputation for being low maintenance, fun. Not the kind of girl who demanded a safety briefing. Those two parts of me argued, while his right foot made a choice on my behalf. The city thinned. Buildings stepped back. We turned off a bright avenue onto a quieter service road that ran behind warehouses and chain-link fences. It felt like slipping into an alley inside the night itself. No restaurants, no pedestrians, only a rhythm of street lights and the seam of asphalt stretching into a narrow horizon. The car answered his pressure like a trained animal. The hood drew down toward the pavement. My body slid a fraction into the seat. The fabric gripped my skin as if the upholstery had learned a new cling. The speedometer's needle climbed with a calm certainty that felt obscene. I kept my voice even. "How fast is this?" He smirked. "Fast enough to keep things interesting." The air inside the cabin changed. It carried the faint mineral scent of heated brakes and something razor clean, like new metal shaved into dust. We were moving in a way that made the world look less like a place and more like a smear of lights and lines. He threaded through the rare vehicles we encountered with gestures that looked casual because he wanted them to look casual. I watched his hands. They were steady, almost reverent on the wheel. A private liturgy offered to speed. I watched his jaw, the muscle twitch that came when he calculated the distance to the next bend. And I watched myself in the side window, a pale outline caught between curiosity and dread. A woman rehearsing a sentence she needed to say and still refusing to send it into the air. Tell him to slow down. Tell him to choose you over the performance. Tell him that a good night is one you survive. He laughed softly at nothing and described a story from last month. How he'd raced a friend on a ring road at dawn and, won by a neighborhood. That phrase landed in my stomach like a stone. I pictured the city measured not in miles, but in blocks of risk. I pressed my heels into the floorboard and felt the vibration travel through my bones. The road opened into a longer straightaway. He treated it like a dare. Street lights passed in regular pulses, marking a tempo my heart refused to follow. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance and vanished behind us so quickly it felt like a magic trick. The steering wheel shifted half an inch under his hands. The car changed lanes with the confidence of a decision already made. "Relax," he said. "You're safe with me." That sentence might have been comforting in a different life. In this one, it sounded like a promise he didn't own the right to make. I inhaled through my nose and tasted the sharpness of recycled air and heated plastic. I wanted to say, "I'm not afraid of your driving. I'm afraid of what it says about the way you treat limits." I said nothing. We approached a junction where the main road carried a faint river of late traffic. He cut across to beat a light that was thinking about turning. My shoulder brushed the door. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and cataloged the data points my nervous system kept sending. Palms damp, tongue dry, neck tight. Focus narrowed to a tunnel. There is a point in every story where you decide whether to be liked or to be safe. Choose the second. Choose it even if your voice shakes. He looked over briefly, just long enough to catch my expression. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, the phrase people use when they're hoping to become the lie they're telling. He smiled and returned his gaze to the road. We left the junction behind and slid down another corridor of darkness. The city felt far away now. No music spilling from bars. No couples walking home with boxes of leftovers. No taxis sounding their presence. Only the measured hammer of speed and a sky the color of wet slate. I let my head rest against the seat and mapped my exit strategy. Ask to stop for food. Claim a phone call. Pretend I felt sick. Every option required the same courage I hadn't yet summoned. The straightaway ended at a curve carved between tall hedges. He took it with a confidence that belonged to someone else's probability. The tires held. My shoulders didn't. A calculation flashed behind his eyes and vanished, replaced by the satisfaction people wear when risk pays them in attention. And then, without warning, a new color entered the car. Blue at first. A cool wash across the dash. Then red. A second heartbeat painting the leather. The interior transformed into a moving emergency. Jay checked the rearview mirror, his jaw set. The expression that followed made my stomach turn. Delight braided with defiance. I turned in my seat. 2 cruisers, at least. Maybe 3. Their presence didn't feel like a question. It felt like a verdict catching up to us. He didn't lift his foot. This is the minute, I thought. The minute the road decides for you. The siren tone rose behind the glass like a line drawn across the night. The ahead lane unfurled, indifferent. His hand tightened on the wheel. Mine tightened on the seam of the seat. Red and blue flooded the cabin and chased our shadows up the windshield as we entered the next stretch with a choice I could feel, but not yet force, hanging in the air between us. The sirens cut through the night like knives, each rising wail slicing straight into my chest. The flashing red and blue lights washed over Jay's face, turning his cocky grin into something far more sinister, like a mask that was starting to crack. He didn't slow down. If anything, he pressed harder on the gas, the engine screaming as the car lunged forward. I was shoved back against my seat, every muscle in my body locked in fear. "They're not catching us," he muttered, half to himself, half to me. His voice shook in a way that betrayed how terrified he actually was. I wanted to shout, to beg him to stop, but the words got stuck somewhere between my lungs and my throat. All that came out was shallow, panicked breaths. The city behind us melted into streaks of neon and concrete. The road ahead narrowed, the dark stretching on endlessly. Other cars swerved to the side as the sirens grew louder. But Jay only swerved harder, weaving between them like he thought he was untouchable. My nails dug into the seatbelt across my chest, knuckles bone white, as if the thin strip of fabric was the only thing keeping me alive. Every second dragged like a nightmare you can't wake up from. My stomach lurched with every sharp turn, and the roar of the engine blended with the pounding of my heartbeat until I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I risked a glance at the side mirror. The police were right there. 2, maybe 3 cars. Lights blazing so bright, it burned into my vision. I could see the outline of their bumpers closing in. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some reckless joyride. This was survival. And I was trapped in the passenger seat with a man who thought running was his only option. The speed was unbearable now, the tires biting against the asphalt as Jay pushed the car harder, his knuckles gripping the wheel so tight I thought his skin might split. The sirens were closing in, echoing through the night, like an endless warning that I couldn't escape. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Every breath shallow, sharp, desperate. Then it happened. A violent jolt from behind that threw me forward, my forehead smacking against the cold glass of the passenger window. A metallic screech filled my ears, and I knew one of the cruisers had rammed us. Jay cursed, spinning the wheel, the car fishtailing wildly across the empty stretch of road, my vision blurred with tears and panic as the world outside turned into a dizzying carousel of lights and shadows. The rear end crumpled. The smell of burning rubber filled the cabin, and I could feel the vibration of the car breaking down beneath us. Jay shouted something, his voice breaking with raw fear, but I couldn't make out the words. Another impact struck, harder this time, and my whole body whipped against the seatbelt. Pain flared across my shoulder as the window beside me shattered inward, showering me with razor edges of glass. Cold air rushed in, biting my skin, carrying with it the electric tang of smoke and engine oil. I raised my arms to shield myself, trembling, powerless, trapped inside a cage of glass and steel tearing itself apart. The car spun again, tires screaming, and then everything stopped, dead still, the silence more terrifying than the chaos. My pulse pounded in my ears as I lifted my head, and what I saw froze the scream inside my throat. Dozens of figures, black silhouettes outlined in strobes of red and blue, surrounding us. Guns, real guns, barrels gleaming under the flashing lights, pointed straight at my chest. They yelled for us to show our hands, and I did exactly that. Fingers spread, palms open, body frozen in a shape designed to look harmless even when terror was the only thing moving inside me. The door on my side was yanked open, and a hard voice told me to step out slowly. So I did, sliding my legs toward the gap, one shoe catching on a twisted edge of the floor mat before I found the ground and the shock of cold asphalt. My knees wobbled, and I kept my chin tucked, eyes lowered, because every instinct screamed the same quiet order. Do not give them a reason to doubt you. Someone took my wrist. Not cruelly, just with the kind of certainty that leaves no room for interpretation, and guided me away from the car while another voice kept repeating instructions I had already obeyed. I glanced sideways, long enough to see Jay pulled over the hood, his shoulders pinned, his mouth moving in a furious string of words that no longer mattered because the night had chosen a different author. And it wasn't him. They asked me for my name, my address, my reason for being in that car. I answered in sentences so clear they sounded memorized. And when they asked again, same questions, new sequence, I gave the same answers, because this is what survival looks like when the danger is procedural. You become a record that can be verified. A flashlight swept across my face and lingered the way a scanner lingers. Measuring for threat, another officer searched my bag, then patted down my pockets, and I felt heat climb my neck as a pair of cars rolled past on the opposite lane. Drivers slowing to stare for the free show. Life serves to people lucky enough to be headed home. Someone asked if I needed medical attention, and I said no, even though my shoulder throbbed where the belt had caught me, and a constellation of tiny cuts glittered along my forearm from the burst of glass. The pain felt like an invoice that could be settled later. They told me the vehicle matched a flag for something I didn't want to hear described. And I repeated that it was our first date, and I did not know. I did not know. I did not know. The mantra tasted like metal, but it was true and truth when repeated calmly is a kind of passport. At some point, Jay's voice disappeared into the background and was replaced by radio chatter and the dry shuffle of paperwork against a clipboard. I signed a statement with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. Letters leaning into each other like they needed the support. Then an officer with a lined, tired face told me they'd drive me home. The back seat of the cruiser felt antiseptic. A mobile waiting room with bars of red and blue sliding across the plexi partition. The city outside had put its mask back on. Storefronts dark. Traffic lights dutiful. A couple walking a dog that kept stopping to investigate smells that had nothing to do with fear. And I watched that normalcy slip by like a version of the night I could no longer claim. At my building, the officer hesitated as if deciding whether to add a moral to the end of the story. What he settled on was simple. Be careful who you get in with. I nodded, thanked him, and carried my wrecked calm up the stairs. Inside, the apartment felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that lets memory replay itself at full volume. So I turned on the kitchen light and performed the choreography of ordinary life. Glass from the cupboard, water from the tap, the cool press of the counter under my palms, until my breathing found an even track. When I finally looked down, I noticed a long scratch across my forearm and a thin line where the seatbelt had bruised the soft skin under my collarbone. I washed both gently and watched pink water spiral away, like proof that what had happened could still be moved somewhere else. I sat on the floor by the door and removed my sneakers, discovering a rip along the sole of the right one where the rubber had separated. An injury so small and final that it felt symbolic. That shoe had done its job and paid for it. My phone was a storm of messages from friends who wanted updates on how the date went. All balloons and heart emojis from earlier in the evening, now stacked against the edge of a cliff I hadn't seen coming. I typed nothing. Then opened Jay's chat, deleted his contact, and unmatched him on the app because there was no version of this story where I kept him filed under maybe. I made a promise I didn't fully mean. I'm never going on a first date again. Not because I believe in oaths pronounced from the wreckage, but because sometimes you anchor yourself with a sentence heavy enough to keep you from drifting in the most dangerous direction. I let the sentence sit in my chest like ballast, while the rest of me walked room to room, making sure the windows were locked, the stove off, the world contained. When I finally crawled into bed, I kept the lamp on and lay on my side, facing the door. An old habit from childhood, resurrected by a night that had reminded me how thin the membrane is between expectation and aftermath. Behind my eyelids, the lights still flashed. The car still spun. The ground still rose to meet me. You tell yourself it's only a ride, only a story you'll laugh about someday. You tell yourself you can read people. You tell yourself you're hard to scare. And then you learn the real lesson. The one I will teach myself again every time I scroll past a grin attached to a shiny car and a promise of fun. Ask better questions. Insist on safer roads. Choose the exit, even if it costs you approval. I know this because the memory has already started building its own map inside me. Landmarks, like the cold feel of asphalt under my knees. The chemical sting of leather polish and air freshener in a shattered cabin. The way a stranger's voice can turn into a rope you hold on to when yours won't come. And that map will be what I follow the next time a night tries to decide for me. When it does, I'll decide first. I did not walk into danger. I was escorted to a linen-draped table and invited to mistake polish for safety, money for goodness, certainty for character. The restaurant Alexei chose looked airbrushed into reality. White tablecloths, a chandelier that scattered light into careful prisms, silver that had been polished so relentlessly it almost refused to hold a fingerprint. A maitre d' glided, a sommelier hovered, and Alexei, with his tailored suit and the relaxed smile of a man accustomed to deference, slid into the scene like a final piece snapping into a puzzle. He didn't glance at the menu. He ordered for both of us. seamless, decisive, as if his taste were a favor I should accept gratefully. Pattern interruption arrived not by noise, but by absence, the absence of curiosity, the absence of listening. My questions met clipped replies, a hint of impatience, the slight tilt of his head that suggested my words were a draft requiring his edits. When the wrong bottle of wine landed, he carved into the waiter with practiced precision. No raised volume, just that chilled contempt that peels dignity the way a blade peels fruit. Anchors planted themselves quietly, his steel watch flashing when he checked the time, his hand resting heavy on the table's edge as if the table needed reining in, the napkin folded into a perfect square between his fingers. I told myself stories that would let me stay. Maybe he's stressed. Maybe this is a cultural thing. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Yet each excuse was another thread winding around my wrist. I offered to split the bill out of instinct, and he waved it away without meeting my eyes, as if generosity lost interest the moment it was acknowledged. By the time we stood, the chandelier had turned colder. I wanted home. My car was in the shop, my wallet lighter, and the city pressed warm and bright outside. When Alexei offered to drive me, it sounded simple. Short ride, smile, goodbye forever. Notice his hands, I told myself. Watch the way they grip the wheel. That instruction would return to me later, like a lighthouse signal, repeating over dark water. We glided through streets I knew, storefronts stacking up in familiar order, and I gave him my address as if addresses could assert power. Then the city slackened, blocks thinned, the scaffolding of noise and nearness dissolved. The first turn that didn't belong to my route brushed past with a harmless shrug. The second turn did not ask. Winding lanes shouldered us in, hedgerows lifting like ribs. This was before phones rode in pockets like talismans. This was when a distance could unmake you in minutes. I watched signage fall away until there were only letters I would not remember later, only gaps on the map. Scenic route, Alexei said, with a curve of the mouth that pretended this was a gift. Pattern interruption. I smiled back and felt my pulse push against my throat as if to protest the performance. Remember this feeling, I told myself, the way beauty can hide intention. Fields opened the way a curtain opens on a stage you didn't audition for. A lone barn slouched against sky. Fences stitched the horizon. The air inside the car cooled into something medicinal, the vents hissing with the neutrality of a hospital corridor. The leather smelled clean. My skin felt wrong inside it. I asked to go back. Voice steady, because steady felt like the last currency I had. His reply changed temperature. He didn't raise tone. He condensed. "I've figured you out," he said, like a verdict. And a part of me recognized the knife had been on the table all along. I had chosen not to see it. He spoke of being used for lunch, for gasoline, for the choreography of courtesy that ends with a woman stepping out at her address and waving before she vanishes into a lock. He threaded accusation with certainty, and certainty is seductive because it spares you the labor of nuance. I explained anyway. Connection isn't a bill. Kindness isn't a contract. And the words went nowhere, dissolved by the cold air between us. Outside, a sign for a village I didn't know presented itself and disappeared before I could read it completely. Notice the horizon. Notice the absence of doors. Notice the distance growing teeth. I have never been so surrounded by space and felt so confined. The hedges rose taller. The road pinched into a ribbon where passing another car would require a miracle of physics and courtesy. No houses, no stations, no witnesses. I repeated that trinity until it became a loop that tightened like wire. No houses, no stations, no witnesses, no houses, no stations, no witnesses. Trance loops are the mind's attempt to build a wall when there is no wall to be had. Alexi's hands stayed at 10 and 2. Tendons lit under tan skin. A wedding of control and leisure that made me feel absurd beside him. "I could drive you deeper," he said, conversational, as if itemizing a dessert course. "I could do whatever I wanted. No one would find you for days." Sensory overload arrived in quiet details, a pale smear of dust drifting across the dash from the vents, the sun striking the side mirror and throwing a square of light onto my knees. The precise dryness at the back of my mouth. I imagined my mother at the kitchen window, waiting for a call I wouldn't make. I imagined my keys in the dish by my door that would never be lifted again. Nested story. I remembered a girl from a local paper years earlier. Last seen leaves and a car that turned up clean. The article had used the phrase remote area. I had dismissed the phrase then as scenery. Now it felt like a verdict. Embedded command. Stay calm. Keep the breath low. Do not provoke. I apologized for not making my intentions clear. I apologized for his time. I apologized for daring to inhabit a body that could say no. That last apology I did not voice, but he heard it anyway, because fear speaks fluently, without moving the lips. He kept driving with the patience of a lecture that knows it has an audience captive. My hands rested palms down on my skirt to keep them from trembling. The fields flowed past like a film spooled just a half-second too slow. Time turned viscous. Anchor this detail, I told myself. The tick of his watch every time his wrist shifted on the wheel. It was the only rhythm in a landscape that had canceled clocks. He turned around without ceremony, and that was almost worse. No apology, no justification, just a rotation of the wheel and a sweep of gravel that returned the car to a lane that suddenly remembered how to carry us home. The loop inside me didn't relax. It frayed. My jaw ached from stillness. I stared at the road in front of us and practiced a new loop. Stay quiet. Stay small. Stay breathing. The hedges lowered. A distant water tower stubbed the sky. A tractor appeared and lumbered past. A witness too indifferent to be counted. When streets widened and the first corner shop materialized, like relief given a postal code, I did not allow hope to sprint. I kept it at a measured walk. Anchoring returned. White rectangles of napkins, polished metal, a hand on a wheel, a face that smiles without warming. The car thudded gently over a speed bump. Ordinary. Municipal. The kind of bump that protects school children at noon. And the ridiculous normalcy of it almost undid me. In neighborhoods I recognized. Garbage bins queued like familiar soldiers. A woman tugged a dog that wanted a different route. The sky lost its rural sharpness and became city soft again. When he pulled to the curb in front of my building, relief lunged so hard my fingers shook on the door handle. He caught my wrist before I could open it. The pressure was precise. A demonstration rather than a struggle. I could have done anything, he said, and the words landed not as a threat, but as a postscript he wanted preserved. He wanted the memory to do the work long after he left. Pattern interruption. I did not cry. I did not plead. I looked at the skin whitening beneath his grip and memorized the shape of my forearm in his hand. Embedded command to myself. Get inside. Lock the door. Call someone. He released. I went up the stairs fast enough to feel my breath tear a little. Even that discomfort felt like proof I still possessed a body he hadn't rewritten. Behind my door, I slid the deadbolt and stood with my back against the wood, counting the heartbeats it took for the hallway air to stop, feeling occupied by him. The room around me felt rearranged by nothing but thought. The chair by the window suspicious. The bowl of keys too loud with metal. The glass on the sink, an accusation of thirst I could not satisfy. When I finally lay down, my body did not believe it had permission to rest. It waited for new instructions from a mouth that was no longer in the room. At the station the next day, the fluorescent light took a flat bite out of color. I told the story with the precision of someone walking a narrow shelf. Too much emotion, and the account curdles into drama. Too little, and you sound like you don't know what you are trying to say. An officer typed with 2 fingers, the keys making a dull rhythm that medically separated my sentences. I did not have a license plate. Not exactly. I had a make, a model, a color that looked expensive, and a smile that was practiced. They found him. He arrived crisp. Wealth changes the weather in a room. It persuades fluorescent light to forgive. He explained. He pivoted. He smiled where appropriate. He told them he had taken a longer route because he was enjoying our conversation. He told them I had become agitated. He told them I had misread kindness as coercion. He never said I lied. He made that unnecessary. He let the absence of proof hold the door for him. Word against word is a phrase that pretends to be neutral. It is not. It knows the lay of the land. It knows who is believed without being asked to earn belief. When the warning came, it wore the tone of a teacher sliding a demerit across a desk with a sigh. I tried to catch the eyes of the woman officer by the wall. She looked at the floor. I signed the statement, and my handwriting faltered on my own name as if the letters were a fence I could not climb. Outside, the day had the nerve to be beautiful. I walked home with the deliberate posture of someone refusing to be hurried by a shadow. Anchoring again, I checked the lock twice, then a third time. I became the kind of person who notices the echo of footsteps that are not there. I learned the weight of my keys, like a language I would need to speak in the dark. If you have ever rested your palm against your own front door and felt the wood answer back, you already know what survival sounds like in a quiet key. Weeks later, a dining room with white tablecloths would trigger a breath held for a beat too long. A hand reaching past me toward a wine list would switch on a tremor I learned how to hide by tightening my shoulder blades if a man checked his watch more than once. My chest ran a silent calibration. Anchors everywhere, not to trap me, but to inform me. I stopped apologizing for leaving early. I stopped buying politeness with unease. I practiced sentences that opened exits. I need to go. This doesn't feel right. Please stop the car. Let me out here. Embedded command to the future self. Trust the first chill. Honor the second. Leave at the third. I want to say the story ended in triumph. That fear turned to steel, and the steel to a clean certainty that never failed. It isn't true. What is true is simpler. I stayed alive. and I stayed more myself than I would have if I had accepted his version of me, the girl who owed him a good mood, a longer conversation, a softer boundary. What is true is that I left. I signed. I locked. I learned. There is a version of this story where I never returned to that door. I live inside the version where I did. Sometimes I still measure distance by the memory of hedges. Sometimes a quiet road with no houses will make my hands settle on my thighs the way they did in his car, palms down, as if telling my body to obey. But I also measure distance by the weight of keys in my hand and the simple miracle of a lock turned by my own decision. If I could reach back into the car and speak to the woman staring straight ahead while the fields scrolled by, I would not tell her to be brave. I would tell her to be exact. This is wrong. Turn around. Stop now. The words are not dramatic. They are instructions. They are enough. I believed distance could scrub a past clean. Different neighborhood, different bar, different man. I booked a table on the edge of the city and told myself that trouble didn't like long drives. My name is Camille, and for longer than I want to admit, I was a magnet for the same kind of man. I don't say that to make a villain out of everyone I ever dated. I say it because patterns love to hide inside our preferences. I kept swiping toward menace, packaged as charisma, sharp smiles, restless hands, stories about fights told with the proud detail people usually reserve for graduations or promotions. Some of them moved things they shouldn't for money. Some of them trained their bodies until control looked like bruises. I told myself I was tough enough to manage the fallout, as if endurance were the same thing as safety. That winter, I matched with Tom. He had normal pictures, the kind where a person is laughing with a friend instead of auditioning for a poster. A photo of a trailhead, a dog that obviously belonged to his sister because he didn't know how to hold it. His bio was a paragraph instead of a string of slogans. He worked a steady job. He liked hiking. He asked questions that didn't feel like traps. He sent messages that sounded like conversation, not performance. For 2 weeks, we wrote to each other in the quiet windows around our days. I tested him with small truths about my past. A mention of an ex with a temper. A night in an emergency room for stitches I called an accident. I watched for that flicker of judgment people try to hide behind polite words. It didn't appear. He wrote back as if I were a person with a story, not a case study. That doesn't make him a saint. It made him present. It made me curious about a version of myself that chose different. When we settled on meeting, I chose a pub at the far edge of the city. Not stylish, not crowded, not the kind of place that shows up on lists. It sat near a strip of warehouses with a small square of gravel for a parking lot and a view of a service road nobody loved. The distance felt like strategy. I wanted a buffer zone, a place where memory would have to work to find me. I kept my outfit simple: dark jeans, a sweater with sleeves long enough to hold when my hands needed something to do, boots that could move quickly if they had to. I tied my hair back and looped a plain band on my finger, a habit from years of wanting an object to anchor me when the room changed. In my bag, I carried lip balm, a spare phone charger, and a folded card with an address in case I needed a taxi and didn't want conversation. People who haven't lived with chaos call that over-prepared. People who have call it being alive. Tom arrived on time, average height, brown hair that didn't argue with the wind, a face that softened when he looked at you. He said my name like it was an invitation to speak rather than a test I might fail. We found a table near the back, the kind you choose when you want the room in front of you instead of behind you. The pub smelled like wood polish and malt and the stubborn lemon of an old cleaning solution. A chalkboard listed specials in handwriting that didn't try to be cute. The staff moved with a pace that said they had learned to be efficient without being cold. Conversation was easy, the way a path is easy when it's been walked enough to know where the roots are. We traded small stories, his job, my affection for old records, his sister's dog who hated thunder, the deli near my place that always slid an extra pickle into the bag like a secret handshake. He asked which trails I liked. I told him about a ridge with a view that made the city look like a diagram. He told me about a canyon where the wind made a low, steady sound that emptied your shoulders of all the wrong kind of weight. I didn't notice the time passing until he stood and said he'd be right back. He walked to the restroom with a lift in his step that made me like him a little more. People underestimate what it means to move lightly in a world that rewards display. I watched the door swing and stay shut. I took a sip of water, rotated the band on my finger half a turn, and took stock of myself. Heart steady, shoulders lowered. No need to scan exits. I already knew them. When he came back, he sat differently. Not wrong, just tighter. His smile was present, but it didn't sit as deeply in his face. He listened, but he was measuring something I couldn't see. I asked if everything was okay. He said it was nothing, and looked as if he wished that were true. I let it go. I've learned that insisting on immediate confession rarely makes a person feel safer. We picked up our earlier thread, but the edge of ease had frayed. The pub thinned out. Groups paid and drifted toward the door. The staff started the soft choreography of closing, stacking coasters, wiping menus, counting till drawers below the bar. When Tom suggested we call it a night, I said yes. I liked the idea of leaving while the evening still felt like a promise we could keep. Outside, the lot sat under lights the color of weak tea. The air had that metallic winter taste, and I zipped my jacket all the way and tucked my hands into my sleeves. Tom's car waited near the far corner where the gravel thinned into dirt. I registered the shape of the space, the absence of other people, the line from our table to the door, to the car, to the exit. The calculation calmed me because it was muscle memory. Observe, decide, move. Then I saw them. A cluster at the edge of the lot near the service road. 5. Maybe. Hard to count, because they shifted in that restless way people do when they are looking for momentum more than purpose. Clothes too thin for the cold. Faces tightened by the kind of sleeplessness that eats the soft edges first. A nervous energy around their hands. The sense that the night had not given them what they wanted, and they would take what they could get. One face unlocked a door I had hoped to weld shut. Johnny. He had trailed one of my exes like a shadow for months. A hanger-on who always hovered just outside the worst decisions and then offered to help carry the consequences. I knew the line of his jaw, the posture that tried to be larger than it was, the way his eyes moved, fast at first, then settling with an ugly kind of focus. I leaned closer to Tom and kept my voice low. We should head over quickly. He followed my glance, nodded once, and adjusted his pace without making theater out of it. We cut the distance to the car by half. The group noticed us. They peeled from their cluster and began to cross the lot. Not running, not strolling either, just closing space in a line designed to make a person feel small. Johnny recognized me second, not first. I saw the exact second his face changed. Surprise landed on his features and then smoothed into a grin that had nothing to do with happiness. He said my name like a claim he was revoking. I didn't answer. He asked Tom who he was. The tall one with a shaved head moved to our left. Another drifted wide to our right. They were drawing a circle with their bodies and leaving an opening behind us we couldn't use without turning our backs. Tom kept his tone even. We're headed out. He reached for my elbow, not to control me, to signal, keep moving. I matched his pace. My heart did the arithmetic it does when you have seconds to choose. 5 men. 1 tool in a pocket because of the weight at his jacket. Gravel underfoot that makes balance an issue. A car 10 steps away. Keys already in his hand. Observe, decide, move. Johnny ignored Tom. His eyes stayed on me. Look who crawled out from under a rock, he said. The kind of line men practice when they want to feel like the center of a scene. I had learned another practice. Do not feed the line. He wanted friction. I offered none. We're leaving, I said, and the steadiness in my voice surprised me. He didn't like that. He took a step forward. The shaved head lifted something from under his coat. A length of metal, dark with use. Not a toy. Keep walking, Tom said, just loud enough for me. Another step, and we reached the car. The group condensed. Proximity is pressure, and they knew how to apply it. The tall one's arm moved, and the metal bar cut the air toward the side mirror. The housing fractured. Pieces skittered across the gravel. Another man drove his boot into the door panel. The metal yielded with a deep dent. Spit words from the edge of the group hit the air. Accusations. Bait. Old names they thought would pull me back to who I had been. I did not give them what they wanted. I anchored to the simplest tasks. Hand on the door handle. Find the lock. Get inside. Breathe in a way that keeps the brain supplied. My fingers felt thick, but they moved. Tom's hand was already on the key. He cut his body between me and the nearest man without making a speech of it. He repeated the plan in a voice that carried only to me. Inside, belt on, eyes forward. Observe, decide, move. Johnny leaned toward the glass and smiled as if we were sharing a joke. The metal bar rose again. Not toward the mirror this time, toward the side window, the one that would put 1,000 problems in my lap if it failed. I put my palm flat on the inside of the door, as if contact could make a barrier stronger. Tom's shoulders drew in. He twisted the key. I heard a dozen things at once, without letting any single sound take over. Feet shifting in gravel, cloth brushing metal. The rapid breath I did not want to make an instrument for fear. I kept my eyes on the dash and counted in a rhythm that steadied my hands. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. The bar hung in the air for a heartbeat of decision. Johnny was choosing between humiliation and escalation. I knew men like this. They tested yield and loved spectacle. I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes without giving him the intimacy he wanted. I let my face be unreadable. Men who thrive on reaction don't know where to put a woman who refuses to perform. He didn't lower the bar. He didn't swing it either. The tall one to our left muttered a suggestion I didn't catch, but the tone said he wanted a better story to tell later than broken glass and 2 people leaving. Tom's fingers tightened on the wheel. The car's internal lights dimmed. My seatbelt slid across my shoulder. The group drew closer, then stalled, as if something larger than the lot had paused to see which way the night would bend. Behind the men, the service road stretched, a ribbon of dark with 2 distant pairs of headlights moving parallel to a life I wanted and had not yet earned. I tasted the old shame that rises when your present bumps into your former choices. The shame that tells you every new person is just an audience for the mess you once survived. I named it for what it was and put it down. I would not let it drive. Tom had not done anything wrong by being here with me. I had not done anything wrong by wanting a different life. A second lengthened, then another. Then the moment tipped, not because any speech changed it, but because nights like this obey physics. Pressure meets pressure until one side yields. The group looked past us and registered the pub door opening. Staff stepping out to smoke the first cigarette of closing. A camera above the back entrance they hadn't noticed, lighting its tiny red eye. Johnny's grin faded to calculation. He let the bar drop an inch. Enough to send a message. Not enough to buy a charge he didn't want. Tom's voice came again, low and precise, meant only for me. Now. Observe, decide, move. Tom's single word carried enough force to cut through the noise. My hand pressed the lock. His wrist twisted the key, and the engine coughed alive. Gravel snapped under the tires. The headlights painted the group in sudden white, flattening their shadows and stealing their performance. The metal bar froze mid-air again. Not because Johnny wanted to pause, but because instinct told him you don't step directly into beams that make you visible, accountable. His grin shrank. The men hesitated, a ripple of indecision that was more valuable than any weapon. The car lurched forward. For a heartbeat, I thought they'd lunge, drag a handle, smash the glass. Instead, 2 of them stepped back. One cursed. One slammed a palm against the trunk as we passed. But impact against steel is nothing compared to a window's shatter. We kept moving. The lot fell behind in a scatter of voices. Unfinished threats. A clang of something metal dropped in frustration. Tom's hands were steady on the wheel. His jaw was set, but not locked, like a man who knew panic was just wasted fuel. I counted my breaths. In. Hold. Out. I touched the seat belt, as if to prove to myself it was real. The pub shrank in the rear view, the red camera light shrinking to a dot. "Are you hurt?" Tom asked without looking over. His tone was clinical, but human. The kind of voice that makes room for a yes or no without the burden of explanation. "I'm fine," I said. It was half true. No bruises, no cuts. But adrenaline made my hands tingle as if they belonged to someone else. We drove in silence for several minutes. The city lights grew closer, replacing the lonely stretch of warehouse lots with streets that hummed with ordinary life, people carrying takeout bags, buses sighing at stops, couples arguing about movies. I clung to the ordinary like a rope. Tom finally exhaled hard, the kind of breath people take when they've been holding their body in a controlled frame too long. "You knew him," he said. Not accusation, not suspicion, observation. I nodded. "Johnny." He used to circle around someone I dated. He didn't press further. Instead, "You're not there anymore. You're here." That sentence burrowed deep. Survivors know how sticky the past is, how it attaches itself to the present with invisible strings. Seeing Johnny had been like watching a ghost walk out of the fog, carrying every mistake I thought I'd buried. My reflex was shame, as if Tom now saw me less. But his eyes on the road said something different. He was measuring me by what I did now, not by who had once stood too close. It shifted something inside me, a recalibration. We pulled into a well-lit convenience store lot. He parked under the brightest lamp, angled the car toward the street. Always an exit. Always a plan. That awareness made me feel seen. "Do you want to go in? Coffee? Water?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just a minute." I looked at my reflection in the side window. Pale. Yes. Shaken. Yes. But not broken. The old version of me would have spiraled, blaming myself for choosing the pub, for existing in the same city as Johnny, for breathing the wrong air. Tonight, I chose a different script. I had walked toward safety. I had not fed his bait. I had left without blood spilled or glass shattered. That doesn't sound heroic in a headline, but survival rarely does. Tom sat quietly, letting the silence belong to me. After a while, he said, "They wanted a scene. You didn't give it to them. That was smart." I let the words settle. They sounded like validation instead of pity. We drove again, this time back into neighborhoods lit by porch bulbs and the flicker of televisions. The distance between us and that parking lot stretched into miles, then into something less measurable. I thought about how often I had mistaken chaos for chemistry. How many nights I had told myself bruises were just the tax for belonging. Tonight was proof that it doesn't have to be that way, that different choices lead to different endings. When Tom dropped me at my place, he didn't push for an invitation upstairs. He just said, "Text me when you're settled." That single sentence felt more intimate than any scripted line about protection or vengeance. It gave me agency, not orders. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. My hands still trembled, but the tremor was not the same as before. It was release. I know Johnny will tell his version of the night. He'll make it about dominance, about how close he came to cracking the glass, about how we ran. Let him. Survival isn't measured in how well you perform for other people's narratives. It's measured in walking away intact, with the chance to keep rewriting your own. And that's what I'm doing now. Rewriting. I had been looking forward to that date the way a kid looks forward to Christmas morning, with the same restless excitement and endless imagining of how perfect everything would be. From the moment he asked me out, I had felt that little flutter in my stomach, the kind that makes you smile at your phone like an idiot when you read his messages. He carried himself like an old-fashioned gentleman, the kind you don't think exists anymore, the kind with a warm smile that felt genuine and a way of talking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When he listened, it wasn't with the glazed-over eyes of someone just waiting for their turn to speak. He nodded, leaned in slightly, asked questions that showed he was actually interested. That was rare, and I noticed it right away. We'd met through a mutual friend at a casual gathering. Nothing special, but something about him had stayed with me after that night. We exchanged a few texts, playful and light-hearted, and then he suggested dinner, followed by a walk on the beach. It sounded so perfect, I almost laughed, because it felt like a scene stolen straight from a romantic movie. The kind where everything is lit with golden light, and there's soft music playing in the background. I spent way too long deciding what to wear. My closet looked like a hurricane had hit it. Dresses draped across the bed, shoes scattered on the floor, mirrors reflecting my indecision. I wanted something that showed I honored, but not something that screamed I tried too hard. In the end, I chose a simple sundress, light fabric that moved when I walked, something that made me feel comfortable but still pretty. I slipped on a pair of sandals and stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath, telling myself not to overthink it, that it was just dinner, just a date. But deep down, I hoped it would be more than that. My nerves hummed under my skin like static electricity. And every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, half afraid he might cancel, half hoping it was him saying he was already on his way. The city outside my window was glowing with the first hints of evening. Street lights flickering on, cars moving in slow streams, the air holding that faint, salty tang from the ocean nearby. By the time he texted that he was outside, I felt my pulse in my throat. I grabbed my bag, did one last glance in the mirror, whispered a quiet wish for things to go well, and then stepped out the door. He was leaning casually against his car when I arrived, a smile breaking across his face as soon as he saw me. And in that instant, every nerve I had seemed to calm just a little. He opened the door for me, a gesture that felt sweet and old school. And when I slid into the seat, I caught the faint smell of his cologne, clean and warm, something I wanted to lean closer to. We drove toward the shore, and as the city lights faded behind us, my excitement only grew. We pulled into a little seafood place near the shore, the kind of spot you only find if someone tells you about it, tucked between a surf shop and a weathered motel with chipped blue paint. And from the car, I could already see the warm glow of string lights draped across the patio and the slow movement of ceiling fans pushing salted air through the doorway. Inside, the room smelled like fried shrimp and lemon butter and something briny that reminded me of summers that felt simpler. And as soon as we sat, the server brought cold water with slices of lime and a basket of warm bread I didn't know I needed until I tasted it. He was easy conversation right away. The good kind, not the forced small talk that makes you check the time. He asked what I grew up watching, and I told him about the old animated films my dad kept on DVD, the ones I could still quote. And he laughed in a way that didn't make me feel self-conscious. Then told me about a dog he'd had as a kid, a mutt with one ear that never stood up, a dog that followed him everywhere until one morning it didn't. And he paused there, like the memory had more weight than he cared to admit, before he smiled again and pivoted to lighter ground. The server came back with a shared plate of oysters and a little tray of condiments, and he let me choose first, without turning it into a performance. He watched my face as I tasted one, not to judge me, but to memorize the reaction. And I felt seen in a way that felt rare and a little addictive. Our table was tucked by a window, where we could see the shoreline begin to dim as the sun dropped, and the horizon was bleeding into those colors postcards never quite capture: orange to coral to pink. And I could hear waves outside in a low, steady rhythm that made me think, almost against my will, that life could be simple if you picked the right person to share a meal with. He told me he liked surfing when he could get away early. Not because he was good at it, he said, but because it forced him into the morning alone with the water and no phone demanding anything. He said he liked the first paddle out when the day hasn't started and everything feels negotiable. And I said that sounded like church without the building. And he smiled, like the comparison made sense. He asked about work and didn't glaze over when I talked about the details that usually bore people. And he remembered things I'd mentioned weeks ago in texts, like the friend who had moved away and the plant I kept failing to keep alive. He made a joke about needing a plant sitter, and I said I would just stop pretending to be someone who could keep anything green flourishing. And he said there was nothing wrong with knowing what you're good at and what you're not, which sounded like an ordinary line until I tucked it away and realized later how much he would expect himself to decide where those lines sat. The food arrived: crispy calamari, grilled fish with charred lemon, a salad that surprised me with how fresh it tasted. And he insisted I try what he ordered before he took a bite of his own. The kind of small gallantry that felt almost cinematic, because nobody does it anymore without making a production of it. Except he didn't make a production of it. He just did it and kept talking. He had stories, the kind of middle school and high school misadventures that usually ring false when someone tells them too loudly. His were specific and quiet, like the time he broke his arm trying to leap a fence and lied about it so his mother wouldn't worry, like the time he cut class to drive to the coast and sat in the car the whole time just to listen to the water, because going back felt worse than getting in trouble. And the way he told them kept me relaxed, like he had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. The server checked on us, and I watched how he spoke to her, and he was courteous without being performative. No impatient edge, no smirk, just a simple thank you and a look that matched the tone. If you had asked me then to mark a single red flag, I wouldn't have had one to point to. And that absence became its own kind of comfort. He lifted his glass and asked what I was hoping for this year. And the question caught me off guard in the best way. I talked about wanting to travel, but not in a way that turns your life into a highlight reel. More like picking a city and staying long enough to learn where the locals actually go. And he nodded, as if he understood. then told me about a book he'd been trying to finish and couldn't. Not because it was boring, he said, but because it was too good, and he didn't want it to end. I caught myself watching his hands as he talked, the way his fingers traced a line on the condensation of his water glass, the way he rested his palm on the table when he was listening, still and attentive. It's strange what your mind decides to memorize when it thinks it might want to keep someone. The bill came, and he reached for it without a show of dominance. Just a quiet assumption that dinner had been his idea, and he wanted to treat. And I offered to split, because I always do. And he shook his head once, with a look that didn't invite debate, but somehow didn't feel unkind. I told myself it was a kind of old-fashioned I could live with, because it didn't come packaged with a lecture. The light outside had softened into that hour when everything seems to hold its breath, and the air that drifted in each time the door opened was cooler now, carrying the scent of salt and sunscreen and a hint of bonfire smoke from somewhere down the beach. He looked toward the water and asked if I still wanted that walk. And I said yeah, without hesitating, because the night had set itself up like a promise, and I wasn't ready for it to end. I wanted to believe kindness lived behind that smile, and would still be there when the sky turned black. And with that faith, I stood, smoothed the skirt of my sundress, and followed him out toward the shoreline where the path dipped down from the road, thinking about how rare it felt to be fully at ease with someone new, and how easily a person can confuse ease for safety when all you've seen so far is their best light. We stepped out into the night, and the air felt cooler by the water, the kind of clean salt that clears your head and makes every breath feel new. And we followed the wooden path down to the sand, where the tide had smoothed everything into a faint silver sheen. I slipped off my sandals, and the ground was cool enough to make me shiver. A pleasant kind of shiver that I mistook for happiness. And we walked side by side, with our shadows stretching across the beach ahead of us, like two quiet witnesses. The shoreline was lively, but not crowded. Families packing up blankets, a couple tracing their names near the foam, someone strumming a guitar far enough away to feel like a memory, and the last of the color hung over the water, orange fading to pink, to a bruised purple that promised a clear night. He talked easily at first, pointing out constellations he swore he remembered from a camping trip, laughing at himself when he mixed up their names, telling me he could never keep track of myths, but loved the idea that people long ago stared at the same sky and needed their stories to explain it. I told him which star I always look for when I feel lost. And he said that made sense, because I seemed like the kind of person who memorizes a landmark and builds a route around it. We moved in a comfortable rhythm, our steps sinking in and lifting out together. And the conversation drifted from favorite beaches to the way the ocean changes color, depending on the time of day, to where we would go if we could wake up in a different city tomorrow. He said he would choose a place with a break good enough for small, forgiving waves, because he liked the feeling of failing without consequences. And I said I would choose a place with markets in the morning and lights at night, because motion keeps me from overthinking. Somewhere between one topic and the next. The texture of his voice changed. Less air, more certainty. A subtle thickening, like a cloud moving over a moon. And he started telling stories that were less about places and more about people, especially his family. And he described his mother as soft-hearted in a way that sounded admiring until it didn't, and his father as direct in a way that sounded like praise until the edges sharpened. He kicked at the sand as we walked and said, almost offhand, that sometimes a relationship needs hard boundaries, that sometimes people get carried away with emotions and push things too far. And I asked what he meant, and he said, a home runs better when one person leads. No drama, no arguments, just a clear line and respect for it. I felt a prickle across my shoulders that had nothing to do with the breeze. And I asked who decides where the line is. And he laughed softly, like the answer should be obvious. Then said the person with the clearest vision, the one who knows what's best. We reached a darker stretch of beach where the houses were farther apart and fewer people walked by. And he told a story about his childhood in a tone that tried to be neutral and couldn't quite get there. How his dad had sometimes corrected his mom when she spoke out of turn. How it didn't really hurt anything, because afterward they would be fine. And the way he said corrected made my stomach tilt, because the only thing a word like that does is try to put a suit on something ugly. I stopped walking for a second, without meaning to, just long enough for him to take 2 more steps before realizing I wasn't beside him. And when he turned back, I searched his face for irony or shame, or even the kind of discomfort that says a person knows the difference between normal and unacceptable. I found none of it. He kept going with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this version of events, that everyone fights, that sometimes emotions get loud, that his father believed in keeping order, and his mother respected that it wasn't anyone else's place to judge what works inside a marriage. The night air that had felt clean a moment earlier turned heavy, and I became aware of my heartbeat in the base of my throat, a metronome I couldn't quiet. I heard my own voice ask the question before I had officially decided to ask it. Did he think it was okay for a man to lay hands on a woman for speaking up? He tilted his head a fraction, like he was surprised by the wording, and said, "It depends on the context." That people outside a situation never understand what's required to keep things steady. That sometimes strong reactions prevent bigger problems. Later, the waves rolled in and thinned over our feet as if to cool the moment. But the warmth had already drained from my chest and been replaced by a bright, focused certainty. I told him I didn't agree. That no relationship justifies violence. That control dressed as love is still control. That what he described wasn't a boundary, but a violation. I kept my tone level because I wanted the meaning to be the only thing that carried heat. And for a second, I thought he would hear it, that he would step back from the sentence he had just delivered and revise it like a math problem with the wrong answer. Instead, something in his expression sealed. The softness I had read as attentiveness turned into a flat, assessing stare. The kind of look that strips you down to categories, agreeable or difficult, loyal or disloyal. He said I had misunderstood his point, and that this was exactly why people keep their private lives private. Because outsiders want to paste their rules onto homes they don't live in. I said, harm is harm, no matter which roof it hides under. We stood facing each other as the water drew a clean line around our ankles and retreated. And it felt like the beach itself was deciding which version of the night would be allowed to proceed. He stepped closer, not enough to touch me, but enough to close off part of the breeze. And his mouth began to shape a correction that sounded less like dialogue and more like a warning. In the distance, a group laughed near a cluster of beach chairs, and I anchored to that human sound as proof the world still contained better versions of people. There are moments when you feel the hinge of a story loosen, when everything you thought you were inside begins to tip, and your body knows before your mind that you should step back. I told him again, clearly, that hurting someone to win an argument is not leadership, and the muscle in his jaw ticked once, like the flicker of a lighter. He didn't raise his voice. Not yet. But the volume inside each word grew. He said I was insulting his family, that I was painting his father as a monster, that I didn't know the history, the context, the pressures. and he laced the word context with a kind of reverence that tried to make it sound like a sacred shield. I said, respect without safety isn't respect, and love that requires silence isn't love. The ocean breathed in and out. The night pressed a little closer, and from where I stood, I could feel an invisible border forming around us, a small circle in the sand that separated the version of the date I had hoped for from the version that was about to begin. He closed the distance the way a storm closes over a quiet afternoon. Not with a single dramatic gesture, but with small decisions that swallowed the light between us. His posture lifted, shoulders tight, chin forward. And the set of his mouth told me he had stopped hearing anything except the fact that I had refused to agree. I tried one last time to lower the temperature, told him we could walk back toward the crowds and keep talking, that we could disagree without turning it into a test of who would fold. But his eyes had gone flat in a way that made the night feel narrower. He said I was disrespecting his family and asked what kind of person judged something they didn't understand. And every word carried the weight of a verdict I hadn't consented to stand trial for. I took a half step toward the brighter part of the beach, and he matched it, which is when my body understood what my brain was still negotiating. This wasn't a conversation anymore. His hand closed around my forearm with a force that erased everything soft about the evening. Fingers pressing into muscle with a certainty that made my balance tilt. The shock of it wasn't just pain, but the revelation that the person I'd been laughing with an hour earlier had always contained this other shape. And now he'd chosen to wear it. Say no clearly, I told myself, the way you practice a safety phrase in another language. I told him to let go, kept my tone even, made the request simple so there would be no mistake. He didn't. He pulled. Not enough to drag me, just enough to prove he could. And when I tried to twist free, his grip tightened until heat surged under my skin. I raised my other hand to push his wrist away, and that was when he delivered the first strike. Flat, fast, calculated. The kind of movement that doesn't require rage so much as permission, granted somewhere long ago. The contact bloomed across my cheek in a bright, stunned flare, and the world narrowed to the clean line of horizon and the taste of salt that wasn't only ocean. I staggered and caught myself, breath coming in short, efficient bursts that felt like instructions from a distant operator. Stay upright. Keep space. Mark exits. He stepped in again, and his fingers found my upper arm, squeezing hard enough to make my shoulder throb. My words crowded each other on the way out, and I told him to stop. Said his name. Said we were done. Said this was over. But the engine running behind his eyes had already drowned out everything except the idea that he had been challenged and must restore order. The second blow landed lower. A closed fist to my shoulder rather than my face. As if he were performing a lesson, the shock shot down my arm and left my hand numb for a heartbeat. And in that strange quiet inside the noise, I felt a thread of clarity pull taut. I would get out of this by staying specific and by not negotiating with the part of him that wanted me to shrink, create distance, move toward people, keep your voice level. I angled my body to the side and tried to pivot toward the glow of a cluster of beach chairs down shore. He blocked with a step that cut off the line and told me I was overreacting, that I was trying to humiliate him, that I didn't understand the damage I was doing by saying the things I'd said. His words came clipped, heavy with a pride that needed stage lighting. And I realized the audience he performed for wasn't me or the strangers on the sand, but a courtroom he carried inside himself, where he was always prosecuting disrespect. I repeated the only sentence that mattered: let go. And when he didn't, I pitched my voice louder for the space rather than for him and said I needed help, not as a scream, but as a clear transmission meant to travel. He flinched at the shift in volume, tightened his grip once more, and hissed a warning that pretending to be a victim would make things worse. The part of me that still wanted to believe in reason tried to answer, but the rest of me had already taken over with a set of practical tasks. Plant feet, twist through the hold, break the line at the thumb, step back, square shoulders, fix eyes on the nearest cluster of people. He lunged to reclaim space, and I used that forward momentum to wrench my arm free, the way you're taught to break a grip. The skin burned where his fingers peeled off, and I tasted the copper tang of adrenaline at the back of my throat. But the radius of his control had finally loosened. He reached again, and I stepped away hard enough that sand gave under my heel and sent a spray across my calves. I regained balance, lifted my chin so my voice would carry, and said I needed assistance, that I was being hurt, that I did not consent to be touched. The night, which had moments earlier felt like a sealed room, suddenly had seams. I saw heads turn in the near distance. A pair of silhouettes straighten from their chairs. A woman drop a tote and start walking toward us with purpose. Another figure beside her, lifting an arm to point. He registered the shift the way a trespasser registers a porch light flicking on. His face hardened into something both smaller and more dangerous. The mask of a man choosing between escalation and retreat. He gripped my wrist one last time and leaned in so close I could count the pale flecks in his irises. In a voice pitched for my ears alone, he told me I should be careful about the stories I tell. That stories have consequences, that people who make scenes rarely like the ending. Then he felt the presence of others, closing, and released me with a shove meant to rewrite the scene. To make my stumble look like clumsiness, rather than a calculated separation. I corrected my footing and pulled my shoulders back as 3 strangers arrived in a single front, 2 men and a woman in a sweatshirt still dusted with sand, placing themselves between us with the uncomplicated geometry of a door suddenly locked. The version of the night I had hoped for dissolved into something raw and bright and undeniable. And in that moment, I stopped wishing to smooth it over and started choosing to survive it in a way that would leave a record no one could edit after the fact. The woman in the sweatshirt stepped forward first, voice firm and even, telling him to back away while her hand hovered near my shoulder like a promise of steadiness. One of the men positioned himself slightly to my right, the other to my left, and without theatrics, they created a human wall that shifted the power in the sand. And you could feel the moment his confidence faltered because his eyes lost their fixed point and started to scan for an exit. I pressed my palm to the tender throb blooming across my cheek, said clearly that I had been struck, that I needed space, and the woman met my eyes and said she was with me, that I wasn't alone. And those simple words were the first solid ground I had felt since the evening began to tilt. He tried to talk past them, claimed I had misunderstood, that nothing serious had happened, that we were just having a heated conversation, and the woman countered without raising her volume, saying she had seen enough, that he needed to step back now. He bristled and took a half step forward. But when more heads turned and a couple abandoned their beach chairs to join the perimeter, the calculus changed, and he pivoted away with the jerky dignity of someone who needs leaving to look like a choice. The man on my left had already pulled out his phone and was contacting law enforcement, giving details in crisp phrases while keeping one eye on the figure moving down shore. Another passerby angled their camera toward the scene. And that act, documentation, quiet and precise, seemed to seal the decision for him, because he broke into a fast walk and then into the kind of disappearing stride people use when they want to be swallowed by darkness. We stayed where we were, a small island of witnesses, and I knelt because my knees had begun to shake hard enough to compromise standing. The woman crouched with me, offered a clean towel from her tote for the small cuts on my forearm, and asked steady, practical questions. Name. If I felt dizzy. If anything in my vision blurred. And I heard myself answer in full sentences with a politeness that felt foreign in my mouth, as if courtesy could still stitch this night back together. The first patrol unit arrived quickly, lights washing the sand in disciplined pulses, and an officer with a lined face and a patient cadence guided me a few steps toward the boardwalk, where the footing was stable and the light better. He asked for my account, and I gave it in order, start to finish. Dinner to shoreline, to the sentence that broke the spell, to the first strike, to the intervention. And as I spoke, I noticed how the facts sounded when flattened onto a report, how the heat drained from them in a way that made them easier to hold, but also more surreal. Like naming a storm on a map after you've already been drenched. They took my description of him, asked for his number, asked how long we'd known each other, asked whether I had somewhere safe to go that evening. Another officer collected contact information from the 3 strangers who had stepped in, thanked them in a tone that made gratitude sound like a job duty rather than sentiment. And the woman squeezed my hand once before spelling her name slowly for the clipboard. Someone offered an emergency blanket I didn't think I needed until it was around my shoulders, and I felt the sudden drop in temperature that follows adrenaline, that abrupt hollowing where strength used to be. I let the edge of the fabric rest under my chin and focused on breathing in steady counts while they radioed along the beach for a visual and checked nearby exits to the road. No one found him, the officer told me. That didn't mean the pursuit would end. That names and numbers have a way of narrowing distances, but that tonight they were going to prioritize my safety and accurate documentation. I nodded, signed my statement with careful letters that leaned together for support, and agreed to let a unit drive me home because the thought of walking to a rideshare alone turned my skin cold. The ride was quiet in the way hospital corridors are quiet, full of a professionalism that lets you borrow calm. Street lights passed in measured intervals, and I watched a version of the evening I thought I was going to have dissolve in the window's reflection. A soft-edged image of a sundress and a walk that should have ended with sand brushed from our ankles, and a simple goodbye at my building door. The officer paused, as if debating the right sentence, and settled on the one I needed. You did the right thing. I thanked him, meant it, and carried the emergency blanket upstairs because its weight had become a kind of permission to rest. Inside, I locked the door, powered my phone down to stop the flood of messages, and sat on the floor beside the couch with my back against the cool wall. My cheek ached in a climbing pulse, and my shoulder bloomed with a deepening bruise, evidence printed onto skin that would take its time fading. And I accepted that my body would remember this night, whether my mind wanted to or not. I showered, not to erase anything. There is no erasing. But to draw a clean border around the hours to come. Then dressed in soft cotton and made tea I barely tasted. When I finally turned my phone on, I deleted his contact without reading our thread, unmatched him on the app, and sent a single message to the mutual friend who had introduced us. A clear, factual account with no commentary, so there would be no temptation for anyone to file it under miscommunication. Calls came from the authorities over the next few days, asking for clarifications, and updates that were really placeholders because he hadn't been located. I answered every question, organized my notes, took photos of the bruises in natural light, because accuracy is its own form of self-respect, and told no elaborate story when coworkers asked why I seemed tired, only that I was taking a week to quiet my life. Trust didn't vanish overnight, but it changed shape. It became something I built in layers instead of handing out whole. A structure that requires time and evidence and no tolerance for jokes that flirt with control. I practiced leaving at the first sour note. Practiced saying, "I'm not comfortable," and meaning it. Practiced recognizing the difference between attentiveness and assessment in a man's eyes. The lesson is not that romance is dangerous. The lesson is that safety is a choice you make every time you sense the ground shifting under a conversation. And though I can't pretend that the thought of first dates doesn't make my ribs stiffen now, I can promise that I will never again ignore the prickle at the back of my neck in exchange for a pretty evening. I still hope for kindness. I still believe in warmth, but now I carry something else alongside those hopes. A map of exit routes and a reminder that the first person I have to protect is the one I bring to the beach. It began the way all dangerous nights do, with something that looked safe, something that felt warm, something that promised only joy. I was 22, raw from college, and carrying the optimism of someone who still believed that every smile might be genuine. The coffee shop where I worked had become a little theater of possibility. He had walked in often, Stephen, with the kind of presence that didn't need to demand attention. He was tall, his hair a mess that seemed deliberate but wasn't, and his confidence radiated in a way that wasn't sharp or cutting. It was the kind that softened a room instead of consuming it. Each time he ordered his black coffee, my stomach turned as if it were reminding me I was still alive. So when he asked me out for dinner, I said yes before the air had time to cool between us. That Friday night, I stood before my mirror too long, pulling dresses on and off, as if fabric could rewrite my destiny. I settled on something simple, the kind of outfit that suggested effort, but not desperation, and told myself it was just dinner. Stephen arrived with the reliability of someone who respected time. His smile disarmed me immediately. He drove me to an Italian restaurant tucked between old stone buildings, the sort of place where the air was perfumed with garlic and wine, and the candles dimmed the world into intimacy. Conversation flowed like we had known each other for years. Music, movies, travel. Our words wove together so easily, I almost forgot this was our first official date. When the plates emptied and the night still felt young, Stephen suggested a club nearby. I accepted eagerly. The club swallowed us whole. Flashing lights, vibrating floors, strangers laughing too loudly. It was intoxicating. Freedom is always sweetest when you think you've earned it. We danced until sweat blurred the edges of everything. Drinks, overpriced, but worth it, slid down my throat, and I laughed louder than I had in months. The blur of lights made me believe for a moment that danger belonged to other people, not to me. And then he appeared. Dan, a man who seemed older, polished, slick. His hair was combed back with precision, his grin wide enough to promise mischief, but never safety. He introduced himself as Dan, though Hot Tub Dan was the nickname everyone used, as if danger disguised itself with humor. He was magnetic, moving through the crowd like someone who already owned it. His words dropped like invitations no one wanted to refuse. And when he offered an after-party at his house, the room itself seemed to lean toward him. People cheered. Strangers became companions, and suddenly we were swept along with 6 or 7 others, funneling into ride shares. Stephen's hesitation brushed against me, a shadow I dismissed as caution too small to matter. Dan's house loomed like wealth incarnate. 2 stories of glass and stone, manicured lawns that whispered of quiet gardeners, and inside, a space so curated it felt like walking into a catalog. Expensive bottles lined the bar like trophies. Lights reflected against marble countertops. And out back, through wide glass doors, the hot tub steamed, waiting like the heart of the night. This is how predators build cages. They make them beautiful enough that you step inside willingly. Music surged. Drinks multiplied in my hand, each one appearing before I had a chance to refuse. People laughed. Bodies tangled in the shallow glow of intoxication. I danced. I talked. I let myself drown in the illusion of safety. Dan was everywhere, pouring drinks, cracking jokes, laughing loudly enough to reassure us all that joy was the only item on the menu. And yet, Stephen lingered near me, quieter now. His eyes scanned, not the decor, not the drinks, but Dan himself. I noticed, but I didn't care. It is easy to mistake caution for boredom when you are desperate to believe you are safe. Hours passed. The digital clock by the bar blinked into the early hours of the morning. I was still buzzing. Laughter caught between me and a group of girls I'd just met. When Stephen leaned down, his lips nearly brushed my ear, but his words cut instead of comforted. We should leave. I frowned. The night was alive. Why go now? He didn't argue loudly, didn't demand. He simply repeated, firmer, quieter. We're leaving. His face carried something I couldn't name, but that I trusted despite myself. So we left. Annoyance curled in my stomach, but I let it sit there. The taxi ride home was silent. His eyes fixed out the window. My mind still tangled in flashing lights and music that hadn't yet left my ears. When we reached my apartment, he hugged me quickly and promised to text. I went to bed, still humming with adrenaline, replaying the dance, the house, the laughter. I did not know then that my life had been borrowed back to me in that small decision. The phone dragged me from sleep too early. Unknown number. A voice too formal to belong to a friend. The police. They asked if I had been at a house party the night before. Confusion weighed me down like fog. I said yes. My chest tightened as they asked me to come to the station. Fear does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives with a voice asking you to confirm your presence. My walk to the station felt unreal. My head spun with half-formed possibilities. A fight, a noise complaint, some trivial legal issue. Anything but what it was at the station. Fluorescent lights bled color from everything. The officers' faces were calm but grave. They asked about the house, the people, the host. My answers felt small, useless. And then they told me a girl had been assaulted at Dan's house after we left. The words landed heavier than anything I had ever heard. My stomach turned cold, and my throat dried. My mind flicked through every second of the night. The hot tub, the drinks, Dan's grin, the way safety had been painted over danger like cheap wallpaper. It could have been me. One more drink, one more hour, one less whisper from Stephen, and my name could have been in their report. The phone rang at an hour when most people would still be asleep. But I was already awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the previous night replaying in my head like a broken film reel. My heart skipped when I saw the caller ID. Police department. I picked it up, and the officer's voice on the other end was calm, but carried a weight that sent a chill through me. They asked if I could come down to the station immediately to give a formal statement about Dan, the man who called himself Hot Tub Dan. My stomach clenched so hard, it felt like I'd swallowed a stone. That was the moment everything shifted from being a terrifying near miss to a nightmare spilling into reality. I arrived at the police station with Stephen by my side, his presence like an anchor keeping me from drifting into panic. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh, bleaching all color out of the world, and I could smell the sterile tang of disinfectant mixed with stale coffee. A female officer guided us into a plain room with a table and 2 chairs. She introduced herself as Detective Collins and said she had a few questions. Her eyes were sharp, studying every flicker of expression on my face as she asked me to recount everything from the beginning. The message on the dating app, the way Dan insisted we meet at his place, the locked door, the wine, the hot tub waiting for us. As I spoke, I could feel myself trembling, not just from fear, but from a dawning realization that I had been one wrong choice away from disappearing into the shadows forever. Stephen squeezed my hand under the table, reminding me I wasn't alone. Detective Collins asked if Dan had touched me, threatened me, or shown weapons, and I explained he hadn't gotten that far. But there had been this overwhelming sense that something very dark was going to happen. "You did the right thing by leaving," she said, her voice low. "You may have saved your own life." When I asked what exactly was going on, she hesitated before finally saying that Dan was already in custody. He had been arrested early that morning after neighbors reported strange noises and foul smells coming from his garage. My throat tightened as she revealed they had found evidence, items belonging to multiple missing women, personal belongings, traces of blood, and things I don't even want to repeat. I remember clutching Stephen's arm, my nails digging into his skin. As the truth sank in, I had narrowly escaped becoming part of that evidence. Over the next few weeks, my life became entangled with the justice system. I was called in repeatedly to clarify details, identify objects, and sit across from lawyers who dissected every word I said. Each visit to the station felt like being dragged back into that locked house, like I could still smell the damp wood of the deck and the sour stench of that untouched wine glass. Stephen never left my side, even when I insisted I could handle it alone. His quiet support was the one thing that kept me from shattering. Then came the day of the preliminary hearing. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Every hallway echoing with footsteps that reminded me of a hospital, clinical and unforgiving. When Dan was led into the courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, my chest tightened so much I thought I might faint. He looked nothing like the charming man who had lured me in with flattering messages and promises of a relaxing evening. His eyes were hollow, darting nervously, his mouth twitching with some private anger. Seeing him like that should have made him less frightening. But instead, it confirmed everything I feared. He was real, and he was dangerous. The prosecution laid out their case: photos, timelines, testimony from women who had escaped his advances in less extreme circumstances, and chilling forensic evidence pulled from his garage and basement. I tried not to look, but every detail made my skin crawl. The defense tried to paint him as misunderstood, lonely, even eccentric. But no one in that courtroom was fooled. By the time the judge denied him bail, I felt a flicker of safety return to me, though it was fragile and could vanish at any second. The full trial stretched on for months, and though I was not required to attend every session, I went to many of them, compelled by something I still can't explain. Maybe it was a need for closure, or maybe it was the stubborn refusal to let him erase my sense of control. Each time I entered the courtroom, I could feel Dan's gaze trying to burn holes in me. But Stephen's steady presence was always there to block it out. I realized I wasn't just fighting my own fear. I was standing for all the women who hadn't been as lucky. The verdict, when it finally came, felt surreal. Guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and homicide. Life sentence without the possibility of parole. The courtroom exhaled as one. But I couldn't bring myself to celebrate. My heart broke for the victims who didn't get to walk away like I did, and for their families who would never stop carrying that grief. In the days that followed, people asked if I felt relieved, if I felt like justice had been served. The truth is, I felt something closer to numbness. Relief came in small waves, like when I realized I could walk down my street without looking over my shoulder, or when I noticed I could finally sleep without jolting awake from nightmares of hot water closing over my head. Healing wasn't immediate. It was a slow, uneven climb. Stephen was patient, never pushing, just there when I needed him, giving me space when I didn't. Somewhere in that stretch of time, our connection deepened into something undeniable. Trauma has a strange way of binding people together. But in this case, it wasn't just the darkness that tied us, it was the laughter we slowly found again. The quiet moments where fear loosened its grip, and we remembered what it felt like to live. Months later, when we sat on his porch watching the sun set, Stephen asked me if I ever thought about what would have happened if he hadn't been there that night. I looked at him and said the truth. I don't think I'd be here at all. Silence hung between us, heavy but honest, and he took my hand in his. We didn't need to say more. Now, looking back, I understand that the scariest part of my story isn't just Dan or what he almost did. It's how easy it was to fall into his trap. How normal it seemed until it wasn't. It's a reminder that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they smile, they flirt, they invite you for a drink in a hot tub. And that's why I share this story, even though it still makes my chest tighten and my hands shake, because if even one person hears it and decides to trust their instincts, to walk away when something feels off, then maybe all the pain and fear won't be for nothing. I survived, but so many didn't, and I owe it to them to never let people forget that danger often wears the face you least expect.